Hosts, Pastor Kent Smith, Pastor Trent Smith, Kayla Smith, and Alex Shirley. Thank you so much for joining us as we dive into a new episode.
Good morning and welcome to Hope for the Soul. I'm back.
She's back, people.
Okay, so Abraham Lincoln was giving a speech, and this little lady goes to him and says, "If you were my husband, I would poison your tea." He said, "Ma'am, if I were your husband, I would drink the tea."
And welcome to episode of Hope for the Soul, where we talk about.
Did y'all get it?
Yes, we got it.
Okay.
He would want to take another path in life.
Right, exactly. Just making sure, because y'all struggle sometimes.
All right, so that's a great or not so great, depending on how you look at it, segue into this episode where we talk about women in ministry.
Women in the ministry.
And maybe that's poisoning their husband. I don't know. But so today we're happy to have Kayla on the episode back on Hope for the Soul. And then, Dad, go ahead.
Well, I want to welcome my favorite human here on the Hope for the Soul. We're going to be gentle with her. We hope she's gentle with us. Today's a good day. My wife, Tracie, is with us, and we've been after her for some time.
Couple years.
To do this with just one episode, and she has not been cooperative in this manner. But today we made her leave home very early to make sure she got here, and she is here.
She was still late. That wasn't her fault, though.
Well, the devil tried to snuff her out today, but she's here.
The devil thought he had her.
And we're talking today about women in ministry, which is, for some, it's quite a controversial subject. And for others, Kayla, I think you were saying earlier today that when you married a minister, you had no clue this was an issue.
Right. I had no clue that women being in ministry was a controversial topic because I grew up, my grandmother was, if my papa did not have my mama, his ministry wouldn't have been as strong as it was. And that's nothing against him. They went to Mexico a lot preaching, and even in a lot of their services, she had to be right there with him. So that's all I knew. I never knew that this was a controversial subject until I was well into my 20s. And I was amazed by it.
It shouldn't be a controversial subject.
It really shouldn't be. However, I think there are 3 or 4 scriptural references that maybe create the controversy. I think if we understand the context from which they came, it's a little more clear or a little less muddy as far as a subject. So I thought we could, for just a little bit, look at the theology of women in ministry, and then go beyond that and maybe ask the girls how practically they find themselves working in ministry. And one of the things that interests me is there's no stronger message. There is no church. There is no kingdom without the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Right.
That is our core thing. Of course, that begins to move further into the new birth message. But the good news, the gospel, was the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And when Jesus had died and been buried, and then when the morning of his resurrection came, the message of the resurrection was placed into the hands of Mary Magdalene. So the very first person to witness the resurrection of Jesus was a lady. And then it became her responsibility to go and to share that good news with the disciples. Mm-hmm. So I think that when you begin to look at Jesus moving forward into our day, you cannot remove women from the message of the good news. They are there. They are there They are there. There's women in every episode, every scene. There's women in some way that are involved with that, and I think that when we consider the importance of women, you cannot have a gospel without the ladies, and they are an increment part. You remember Philip the evangelist. Philip the evangelist he's not the Philip that's listed in the disciples, but he was one of the 7 deacons that was appointed the same time Stephen was appointed. And Philip the evangelist was called, and he was the one who took the gospel to Samaria. He is the one in, I believe, Acts 8 who baptized the Ethiopian eunuch and then was lifted. In Acts chapter 21, we find reference to where that now Philip the evangelist is a little older, and he has his ministry has changed, but we find reference there of a verse of scripture where he had 4 daughters who had never gotten married. They didn't have families of their own, but then there's this neat little clause at the end of that says, "And they prophesied." Mm-hmm. They kept themselves. The King James says they were married. They were not married. They were virgins, and they prophesied. So they had kept themselves. They had kept their honor, and their father had been used in the kingdom, and they too likewise had been used in the kingdom. So we find that there was more than just any single example of ladies that were used in the scripture. However, when Paul starts writing to the church of Rome, and he is if you're familiar with the book of Romans, it's heavily theological.
It's deep.
And if it takes a lot to get past chapter 1, chapter 2, or chapter 8, but to get all the way to chapter 16, that is some heavy reading. But we learn that Paul had sent his letter to the Roman church, and then we learn in chapter 16 how and what method he chose to send this theology. And you've also got to understand that when a letter was delivered in those days by culture, the person who delivered the letter many times would read the letter. And so the person would arrive with a letter, and they'd walk in the door, and they'd hold it up, and they would begin to read. So we see Paul accounting this in Romans 16 when he literally references a lady named Phoebe, who was an elder or an eldress. She was a leader, a servant leader of some type there in the church, and he trusted her to hand carry this letter to the church in Rome. And when he also not only just trusts her with that, but he encourages the Roman church to receive her and to accept her. And so here is a group of people, a church, who is being delivered a handwritten letter or a message, or what we call the epistle to the Romans, being delivered in the hands of a woman, and the Lord and Paul had said, you treat her right, you accept her, and you treat her right. And in that same affirmation of Phoebe, he also mentions a lady named Priscilla, who was married to a guy named Aquila. And he compliments Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla coming before Aquila, he compliments her role in serving in the local church and assisting him. And then he sends a greeting to a lady named Mary. Now, I'm uncertain which Mary that was. We probably could have drilled down and figured out which Mary we're talking about. But this Mary had served well, and he chose to compliment her and thank her and give her a greeting. But then also in the Romans 16:7, he mentions a woman or a lady by the name of Junia. And Junia apparently was noted of the apostles, because Paul says that she was noted or known of the apostles. And so apparently she was a lady that was used of God as well. And so we find Paul acknowledging women in ministry. And I think that's important to know, that Paul noted these women in Romans, because it's the same Paul whose writings in Corinthians are used by some to say women have no place in ministry.
Right.
Because when you see Paul writing over in to the Corinthians church, he says these words, let the women keep silent in the churches. Let the women keep silent in the churches. And so there are some who have taken a verse and created a whole theology from it.
But the cultural context of that is very important.
So you have to look at cultural context. What is going on? And I don't want to say that it was a different culture, it was a different time. But let's look at what was going on. First, if you're looking at it from a patriarchal view, in those days, women would sit on one side of the church and men would sit on the other side of the church, and they would have discussions and back and forth. Okay, while the men are doing all of this, do you think that these women that have been working in their houses and messing with their kids and doing all their stuff, and they're sitting on the other side of the church, really not involved in the conversation, do you think they just sit there quiet?
No.
There was some fellowship happening.
There was some fellowship happening. And so one view of this is the fellowship on one side of the church and the doctrinal discussions on the other side of the church. I would imagine that the ladies' side of the church was much louder than the man's side of the church. Think Thanksgiving dinner. Who's making the most noise in the house?
Mom and them.
The women's. And so that's one view to look at it. Secondly, if you look at this Greek culture, they worshipped the goddess Artemis, which was the goddess that was supposed to protect the women in childbirth. And so in theory, you remember in early in Genesis 1, the Lord told Adam and Eve that, Adam, as a penalty for your sin, you're going to have to deal with thorns, thistles, and sweat. That's your consequence for your indiscretion. And he told Eve, your consequence for your indiscretion is going to be pain in childbirth.
Thanks, Eve.
Thanks, Eve. And so now let's take that same little thing and move it all the way now to the church in Corinth. And there was already the worship of this Artemis. There was the temple to Artemis. And this was a highly feminist movement. This was a group of the women were priests, men were not allowed in. It was all about fertility and childbearing.
This is not the same synagogue that we were just talking about a few minutes ago.
This is a different church. This is a different way to worship.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that.
And so in the temple of Artemis, this was going on. This was the same women that had been raised up in a culture that there is some goddess that will come and help you and relieve you from the pain and the danger in childbirth, which is completely anti-biblical, anti-theological to what the consequence that was given to Eve.
That was part of the curse of sin. Right?
So part of the curse of sin, and there's this goddess that's supposed to come and help you with that. And so these women in this culture have been raised in this culture that there's no men to be involved in this worship, and it's about the women, and it's about their rights and about their privileges and about their choices and how does this sound like the day we live in?
Absolutely.
With a very strong feminist environment. And so Paul is writing to a culture of women and men that the women have been indoctrinated into this culture that there's a goddess named Artemis that will help you with some of these things. And Paul is wanting to, he's addressing that and saying, clarity. He's bringing clarity to the confusion, because they've been raised in an environment that these women are not going to listen to their men. These women are not going to be submitted to their men, and they're going to, it's just going to be very much like there was confusion, and he was dealing with that confusion. And then when you consider also a few chapters of a different place in Corinthians, he makes reference to when women pray and prophesy in the temple. So now, in one place, he's saying women are to be quiet. And in the same book, he's saying when women pray and prophesy. Is he contradictory here? Is he conflictory here? No, I think Paul is clearly recognizing that women have a place in worship. They have a place in prophecy. They have a place in leadership in the temple, in the house of God.
This is 1 Corinthians 11, just to clarify.
Okay.
And let me just interject here and add to this, because chapter 11, verse 4 says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors God. The next verse 5, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors. So this was the Apostle Paul teaching and admonishing the fact that women and men can be co-equals of some sort in ministry. So that's what I wanted to just clarify what you were saying.
Absolutely. In the book of Job, doesn't it say your sons
Job
and
2
your daughters
shall prophesy.
shall prophesy?
Your servants, your men, and your women servants shall dream dreams. Yeah.
And so there's room for spiritual gifts
Yeah.
in women. This is not just a man thing. This is not this is not a good old boy club.
Right.
This is the kingdom of God. And when he created Adam and Eve, he
Okay.
created them equal to work within the kingdom. There's another scripture that says we submit ourselves one to another. We talked about submission a few days ago. Submission's a two-way street.
Right.
And so when you consider this fact that women have a place in ministry, when you look at this theologically, there are some that say, well, bless God, the women got to be quiet. I think that many of those, they're fine with the women singing. They're fine with the women teaching Sunday school. That they're fine with a lot of these things. They're fine with them being in the choir. They're fine with them being, leading in worship.
Fine with them giving tithes.
Oh yeah, they're fine with them tithes. And fine with them making donuts with the ladies' auxiliary,
Yeah.
or peanut brittle, or whatever it is that we make. But because they have their place. Well, I think women do have their place, and so you have
But
to
it's
look
not out of place.
out of place, and that segues perfectly into where Paul's writing to Timothy.
Yeah.
And he's telling them in 1 Timothy chapter 2 that women should not usurp authority. Usurp authority. Well, I think that when you look at ministry, there are roles and there are means for women to do this. And it would have to be done correctly. I think maybe the best way to describe this is that with our wives, they work with us here in the ministry, and that's why we wanted you here, because we don't work alone, we work with you.
Mm-hmm.
And now for a lifetime, when I respond to something, it's going to be the very same way that she does, and she'll respond many times in the very same way that I do, because we have become one. We become a team. We become a working unit. We're cohesive. And there's times I've heard something about her, and I'm thinking, no, that doesn't sound like the response she would give, because that's not the response I would give, because we work together in the ministry. And so there's times that she speaks for me, and there's times that Kayla will speak for you. And it's not that they are usurping authority over people, because authority that's given cannot be usurped.
That's right. That's good.
And this is the reason many times you may have a lady who pastors a church, but she has a husband that's not even in the ministry. But she's not usurping authority over her husband if her husband has granted her this authority.
Right.
Yeah.
Where we get in trouble is if there is somebody that's usurping authority that's not in submission. Now, whether it's in submission to a husband, or whether it's in submission to overseers, or whether it's in submission to some sort of oversight board, some credentialing group, if
Elders.
if someone is not in submission to them, that shows up in other places.
Right. Right.
So I think that when we consider that a woman shouldn't usurp authority over man, remember, authority that's given is not a usurped authority.
Yeah, and going back to 1 Corinthians 11, Paul was talking about men and women prophesying. So clearly, from the Apostle Paul's perspective, women have their place in the fivefold ministry. If you can prophesy, that makes you what? A prophet.
Or a
member of-
prophetess.
Or a prophetess, yes. And we see that in Scripture as well. So it's hard to refute, even though some do today. Thankfully, hopefully this is a foreign controversy to our church, because they see women involved in so many areas, both up front and behind the scenes.
Here at Conroe Church, we have women on every level of leadership.
Yes.
We even have women on our church board.
Yes.
And I know that there's some who would probably think that we're into some sort of false doctrine with that. But in all reality, we find people that are trustworthy, who are honorable, and we ask them to serve. And there again, it's authority that's granted is not a usurped authority.
Yeah.
And so that's how we operate.
One more thing before we really just open it up and get really practical. Just given biblical context, I want to give three examples of women in ministry, and actually women in a pastoral role in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, a lady named Chloe. The verse says, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 11, some from Chloe's household informed me that there are quarrels. Chloe's household is a reference to house churches, because today we have churches in rows, much like a synagogue format. But the New Testament apostolic church, when it was formed, went house to house, the book of Acts tells us. They had church in circles. And so Chloe had opened her house and was leading a church. Example number 2 was a lady named Nympha. I believe I'm saying that correctly. Colossians 4, verse 15, the church in her house. Third example is Apphia and Philemon, or Philemon, however you say that. Everybody says it different. Verse 2, Apphia, our sister, and the church that meets in your home. Clearly, women are a vital part of the kingdom of God. Now, does that mean that women can't cause problems? Absolutely, because so can men cause problems if they're not submitted. Going back to what Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians 11, I believe that's the chapter where he said, women submit to your husbands, but also husbands submit to God. In other words, men love your spouse as I love you, or as I love the church. So anybody can be out of submission, out of line of spiritual authority, or some would say spiritual covering. That can happen to any and all of us. But likewise, we can all be submitted, and whether it be male or female, we can operate in the gift and the calling of God.
Now, as a ministry here, I don't think we've ever credentialed a lady.
Days coming, though.
I'm looking forward to that,
Yes.
and it's not a matter that we were against that.
Is it you, Alex?
It might be. I started calling Alex last night Minister Alex, so she may be our first. I'm not certain who that will be, but we're anticipating this because the contribution of ladies to the kingdom is immeasurable.
Yes.
The contribution to ladies in the local church without the women, because in all reality, I've learned this, that if the pastor's wife can shepherd the ladies of the church, then the church is being pastored. Because if the ladies of the church are being shepherded by the pastor's wife, the man's job is pretty easy. The pastor's job becomes very easy. And likewise, if the women get bent out of shape, or there's something going on and the women are stirred up, you're going to be dealing with issues everywhere. And the women leaders of the church, the pastor's wives, the shepherdesses, for lack of a better term, they do more in kingdom work than most pastors ever do or would ever acknowledge.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times we refer to our wives as pastor's wife, and people in our congregation, not just ours, but the congregations across North America will refer to the pastor's wife as the pastor's wife. But in our context, and in most contexts now, across our nation, and especially across our fellowship, yes, Kayla is my pastor's wife, but she is also a pastor. Now, she might not be a licensed minister. I hope she is one day. We've been joking about that for a couple of years now. She might not.
For the right reasons, though.
For the right reasons.
We want her to have credentials for the right
reasons.
No comment.
But she is my co-equal. She is my better half, my other half. So we share. She's not just the pastor's wife. She is as much as I am, now in a different role, but she is a pastor. Mom, you are not just the senior pastor's wife. You are one of the pastors at Carnal Church. I love what you said in your remarks. You ministered this past Sunday on Mother's Day. You gave a devotion. You gave a mini sermon. You gave a sermonette, and it was very ladylike, but yet it was very powerful, and it was very encouraging. It was edifying. And there's this role that Dad and I, or men in general, can't always fulfill, that we need the voice of women in our church.
Absolutely. And I'm so happy that you're here today. And I want to hear from you as a lady who has served in ministry alongside me for at least 3 or 4 years, and I'd like to hear your perspective on what you view your role alongside me and alongside the kingdom, and with the people here at Conroe Church.
Well, first off, I've never desired to be licensed.
But Kayla does.
And I never will desire that, I don't think. But I am very much not against it.
Yeah.
And if Kayla or Alex or any of the other young ladies, or older ladies for that matter, in our church, feel that call and they feel that they have a need or a reason to be licensed, I would completely support that. I feel like anything that I do in ministry, anything that I've done in the past, has not been hindered because I did not have a
That's
license.
right.
Right.
That's a whole other conversation that
Yeah.
we might need to have on here, because the credentials doesn't make the minister.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I felt that I could do. Kayla has talents and strengths that I do not have, that I do not desire. In fact, I have shied away from them. And I probably have some that Kayla may or may not have, though she's pretty awesome. And I think anything that I do, Kayla could do equally and even better. And that's my prayer for you and Kayla, that you too could do more than Dad and I ever did. I have always felt very called to nurturing and loving and teaching. I have found myself throughout the years here at Conroe Church being a teacher, whether it was to little children when we first came, because I wanted to make sure that you and Radona had a Sunday school class, all the way till when you kids were in the youth group. It wasn't because I didn't trust other teachers, but I put myself in the rotation with other teachers. And I will always be grateful for those times. And currently, I am teaching twice a month to the young adults. And I feel called at this season to do that. I spend probably no less than 15 or 20 hours a week preparing for that, just as ministers do for a sermon. So I feel very called to that. I feel that a pastor's wife, their first calling, if they're married, a pastor's wife would be married to a pastor, but I feel my first calling is always to fulfill your dad's calling,
Right. Yeah.
because I'm first his wife. My second calling, I always felt, was because I was a pastor's wife, was I was called to you and Radona. And now I firmly believe that my calling doesn't just include Dad and facilitating yours and Kayla's ministry and Hector and Radona's ministry in the church, but is to be called. I feel I am strongly called to helping your children so that you kids could serve in ministry, and that I can help them stand up and worship and do it. Now, I am much more lax on them.
Oh, yeah, you are. But that's probably not for the pod.
But I feel that ladies in ministry have a definite place. And wherever you feel called, then God placed that call. You would never tell me, Trent, that I didn't have a call in my life, just as your dad and just as you have. I have felt called to prayer. And in the beginning years of Conroe Church, always I have got up on Sunday mornings and I've prayed for your dad to be anointed and that he would be sensitive to the needs of the people in the church. And now my time is split between Dad and you because I feel called to pray for you. And those are definite callings. I do not, again, I'll say, I do not feel called to preach. I'm probably a missionary. I've preached to Dad a lot of sermons.
Oh, miss, I see what you did there. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I got you.
Took me a
But
minute.
I feel that ladies do have callings. And in fact, so much so that I can remember it was at the end of last calendar year that in the office it was just you and Kayla and Dad and me. And I began to talk to Kayla very passionately about something that I felt. I feel that the ministers and wives in Conroe Church and those that are aspiring ministry on some level, maybe they may never have a license to preach, but being called to ministry, I felt like those ladies needed to be equipped. And knowing that we're in the transitional place of ministry, I don't mind, Kayla, ever speaking to those ladies, but I felt strongly that you had something to minister to those ladies. And that was a very passionate moment that day in the office when I began to even break down and cry. And I feel tears at this moment thinking about that. But ladies need to be equipped for ministry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was a couple of years ago. I was talking to my friend Paul, who pastors in Ohio, and we were talking about some stuff. And somehow we got off on women in ministry. His wife Brooke is very involved in ministry, and we're talking about that here, about the things that we're dreaming of here at Conroe Church and the direction we're moving. And I look up to him and in that regard. And so then he started laughing, and if you know him, he's real boisterous, and if he thinks it, he says it. It's awesome. And he said, well, at the time, his daughter was 14, and he said that she honestly feels like she's going to be the first female Friday night speaker of North American Youth Congress.
It's awesome.
Wow.
Yeah, and so he was like, and so I'm not telling her differently. And then he said she also wants to be like her mom, one of the speakers at Because of the Times. And I'm not telling her differently. I'm empowering that. I want her to be the first Friday night female speaker. And if you're not familiar with that, North American Youth Congress is one of the biggest apostolic youth gatherings probably in the world, if not the biggest. And so we were talking about that, and it just reminds me that so many times we have to cultivate and develop the gift inside everyone, not just the people who look like us, think like us, or the same gender as us. I was in a meeting a couple years ago, and there's a big group of guys in a circle, and we were talking, and we were getting up all these grand, glorious things that our wives are going to have to do. And I just got to thinking that Kayla's not going to want to do this, and here she is. We're making these decisions, and she's going to have to do this. So I just raised my hand and said, hey, can we have maybe a session where our ladies are in here with us so we can hear their input? And that was apparently not the right thing to say to a couple of those guys. And I'm not casting criticism or judgment, because I think that maybe they weren't raised in a family like I was raised in, full of strong women, or a church that promotes women involved in ministry. So I don't want people to look too far into that. I'm not trying to be overly critical of people with a different opinion than I am. But because I have been raised the way that I have, and Kayla's been raised the way that she's have, that it doesn't threaten me if someone else comes alongside me that's not a man, that is a woman, and contributes to the task and makes the team better, or makes the church better. Because face it, ladies think a lot differently than guys, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. And so when we have input from everybody in a church, when we have input from everybody on a ministry team, it really makes us stronger and more balanced, and it's biblical.
So this prompted my thought. This is an unrehearsed observation. I don't have a scripture to back this up, but if
it sounds good, it's all right.
I mean, it'll preach good with or without a good scripture here.
Don't let the Bible stop.
I think that the man who is strong enough to empower his spouse to become all she can be becomes stronger with that empowerment. Yeah. And let me liken it to what's going on in our transition. The more that I empower you and the next generation of Conroe Church, that's not pushing me back, and that's not me stepping back. But the more that I empower the next generation, or the more I empower the ladies as the senior pastor, the more they grow. They're not leaving me behind in the growth. What they're doing is I'm on their shoulders, and the more they go, the higher they go, the further
we can't hear you.
The higher they grow, the more you grow. I grow with you, and so I want you to grow tall. That way, I'm sitting on your shoulders, and we just all grow together, and I empower next generation, you empower next generation, you empower the next leaders, and as we empower generation after generation, there's something here that is being built that's not being built upon the personality of any one person, nor upon the fragile egos of a patriarchal type system. But it's really something that is embracing and empowering of the ladies. It makes us stronger, and it makes us, I think it makes the ministry of the church more appealing to all. And it creates opportunities, more opportunities for everyone.
Hey, since you're sharing your opinion that might not be biblical, can I share mine?
Oh, this is a non-biblical day right now.
We just ventured out of the text. This is just me.
Out of King James. We're now in the book of Smith.
Now, that is quite a book.
I don't know. So I think that obviously we believe and promote women in ministry. But from a personal standpoint, I don't ever want to see or hear personally, this is just me. It's not saying it's right or wrong. This is just Trent. I don't like it. Maybe you can talk about this too, because we have talked about this. I feel uncomfortable when a lady is in the pulpit or in a leadership role, publicly speaking, and is acting like a man.
Oh, I cannot tolerate it.
I don't want to be overly critical, but I think
Yeah.
since we're talking about women in ministry, I think women in ministry ought to act like women in ministry, not a man in ministry.
Yeah.
Now, I know we are apostolic, and sometimes we get very excited and we get very passionate and our voices get raised and we like to hoop, holler, and yell. But I still think that there's a way to do that with class and femininity.
Yes.
Did I say that right? Is femininity?
Yeah.
Femininity,
For a
not
moment
feminism.
Right.
I felt like I was
yeah.
speaking in tongues there, but yeah, that's a great point. Femininity, not feminism. Obviously, empowering women in ministry is not the same thing as empowering women to step outside of a role that maybe puts them ahead of spiritual authority.
Ladies in ministry should feel very comfortable. Of course, when they're up front, they should be modest. However, they don't have to try to look like a man. I don't think that a lady that's going to speak needs to wear a black suit and a black shirt and a black tie. No, it's fine for her to express her femininity, and of course she will be modest in this. But it becomes a problem, and probably some of the resistance that some have towards women in ministry is because in the past we've all witnessed, and you referenced it, women that tried to outman the men.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk about this, babe.
Go ahead, Caleb.
Well, I'm not going to say anything about anybody that's ever done that. But a personal reference to me, going back King James, would be Queen Esther. She was a huge voice in her day, but my take on her, she did it with such grace. There was never any doubt that she wanted to be manly, or what's the right word for that?
Masculine.
She was graceful, and I try to take that approach. I'm not going to ask Trent, hey, can I preach next Sunday? That's not in me.
You're just going to write a sermon.
Yeah, there we go.
Home
That's
missionary.
how I'll do it. But I've prayed the prayer of, God, whatever you want, I'll do it. And so he asked, a couple of years ago, it was 2019, asked me to speak that Mother's Day. And at first I wanted to say no, but at that particular time, it's going to make me cry. At that particular time, I had been praying that prayer. God, whatever you want, I'm here. And at that time, we had our testimony, my testimony, that I felt like needed to be shared. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. But I'm also not going to say, hey, schedule me to preach,
But you do a good job when you do the high five. So for those that are listening that don't know, we do on Wednesday nights a 5-minute devotional. It's supposed to be 5 minutes.
Sometimes it's a high 10, but
Sometimes it's a high
It's been a high 15 or 20 before.
Yeah, I think we did a high 5 like the first week.
it's a part of our ministry development.
Right. And Kayla, does a phenomenal job of that. And I could not have been more proud when, I don't know whose idea it was to start that.
Sister Shirley.
Sister Shirley.
Sister Shirley. There you go,
Women in
Alex.
ministry.
But then I don't know whose idea it was to schedule you, whether you just said, I'll do it, knowing that there was others that was going to follow. But for years here at Conroe Church, when we had Sunday night church, Dad would tell me, I feel like the church needs to hear from you.
That.
And I never was comfortable with that. But I will tell you now, after the fact, that probably every one of those times, with the exception of 2, like Kayla said, she had a testimony, the Lord had already been dealing with me about something that I felt like I would be sharing with the church. And so I did that. Even knowing that he had been dealing with me, I was probably hesitant. I'm not a real upfront person. I like the behind the scenes better. So I was a little hesitant to do that, and I probably tried to talk him out of that. But in my heart, I knew, because God had already dealt with me. And I have been so proud of you, Kayla, taking those times, because you do have something to say, and you say it like a lady, and you look like a lady, but it's every bit as powerful as any of the men that step into that high five moment. And I feel like the whole congregation appreciates those times that you have something to speak to the ladies. And likewise, going back to what I mentioned about you training those ladies on Wednesday nights, in those times when you're out, and I know that you teach Sunday or Wednesday school or whatever it is on Wednesday night to our children sometimes, but I can look around and tell, oh, this is the night that Kayla has the ladies out. And I've whispered a prayer sitting there on that front pew that it would be anointed. And I was so proud a few weeks ago when church had been out almost an hour when y'all came out of that meeting time, you with the young aspiring ministers' wives. And I have seen something, I don't know if you guys have noticed this or not, but in some of those husbands, since we've started that, I've seen a marked difference in them. And Kayla, I think it's because the empowerment that you are giving to these women in ministry, and they likewise are trusting their husband's call and feeling confident that my husband is called to do something great for God.
When I know my wife is comfortable, this goes for all men. When I know my wife is comfortable in a role, that makes me more comfortable and confident.
Yes.
And likewise, I'm sure that goes the same for ladies as well. That I think that's why the family unit is so important.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's more important now than ever before. I saw last week an NFL football player was given a commencement speech at a university, and he said, this might not be politically correct, but the first thing that you should do now that you've graduated is find the person that you love and start a family. You know, just families are so important, and women in ministry are important, men in ministry are important, but what's most important is that we be unified together. I think in Genesis, you know, God said, let us make man in our own image. So God created male and female. And then God said, subdue it, be fruitful, rule over it. He wasn't only talking to Adam. He was talking to Adam and to Eve. And I know we've ventured some from just women in ministries, and now we're talking about partnerships with husbands and wives. And not every lady in ministry will be married, maybe.
No.
But there's still a partnership. And I think that partnership is really tied to authority. And whenever we're submitted to each other and submitted to God, we can have dominion and subdue the things that God has tasked us to subdue, the culture, the spirits of this world. We can have dominion and authority.
We've got a great example of this here right now. We constantly pick and reference on Alex, but we brought her from Bible college, and she's on staff, and she is just involved in most of the ministry things that happen around Conroe Church.
She's
right
not
now.
a preacher's wife. She is a part of the ministry team.
And I think that Alex gives us an example of what we're seeing involved in the church culture, that young women are being empowered to acknowledge a calling, whatever that calling is, and it's not necessarily just cooking and cleaning or playing the piano or whatever, but it's really real life, reality based areas of ministry that are out there, and young women are being allowed into these roles now, and I'm highly excited about Alex, and I'm proud of what she's doing. But I think that if we're going to say we believe in these things, then I think we have to find a pathway to allow that to unfold.
But I think I would be remiss if I didn't point this out, that before Trent, you asked Alex to come here even as an intern. You reached out to her pastor, and you made sure that he was okay with that. And then again, you and Alex both talked with her pastor before she came on staff.
There was a role of authority.
Full time. So it's back to that submission. I know in our discussions, Kent, you and yours and my discussion here today, and then Trent and Kayla's, we've mentioned the spouse, because Kayla, Trent is your pastor,
right?
And his dad, of course, but that is the pastor figure to you, and mine is Kent. So that is our submission place. But in Alex, because we're bringing her into it, she still had that authority figure that she reached out to, and you reached out to. You didn't bypass her pastor. And still, so that points out that there's still that submission line that has, whether it's a single person or not.
All right. Alex, you need a microphone on this episode. All right, I think we're good. Y'all have anything else that you want to throw in?
That's all, folks.
I hope that this episode has been an encouragement to you, and not controversial, but the true conversation based off the context and the principles of the Bible, of how modern ministry should be and operate. So tune in again. Next week is the last episode of this season. Then we will be back in August. So tune back in next week, and then we'll take a few weeks off, a couple months off, and we're going to be preparing. Well, we won't be broadcasting. We're really not taking off, because we're going to be recording some episodes over the summer as well. So once again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon here on Hope for the Soul.
Bye. Hey guys, thank you for listening to Hope for the Soul podcast. Before you go, like and comment. We want to know what you're getting out of the podcast. Leave us a review. Subscribe. We do not want you to miss a thing. And lastly, share us with a friend you think needs to hear this. Our goal is to deliver content that will give hope. Regardless of what is going on in the world, we believe that Jesus is the ultimate solution to every problem.